Takumi is lying in the wet grass of early morning Kamikochi, his back pressed against cold earth, eyes open to a sky the color of pewter. Momiji is curled on his chest, one small hand gripping the collar of his faded green jacket, fingers no bigger than new buds on a winter branch. Yuki rests her head on his legs. The old dog's eyes are closed, her breathing slow, her white fur still beaded with morning dew. Three creatures on one patch of grass, nobody moving, nobody needing to. Momiji's breath warms the hollow of his throat. Yuki's breath warms the fabric at his knee. And Takumi lies between those two currents of warmth, eyes closed, utterly still. 6 weeks ago, none of them knew the others existed. Takumi arrived in Kamikochi on the 12th of November with 3 bags of equipment and a 3-week contract. His first morning, he was up at 5, green jacket on red wool scarf wound around his neck, camera bag over his shoulder. Kamikochi in November has a smell, unlike anywhere else. Wet soil, maple leaves rotting underfoot, wood smoke drifting from somewhere far down the valley. The fog still lay along the Azusa River, white and dense, pulled apart in places by the current of cold air moving through the gorge. He stopped on the wooden bridge and looked down at the pale green water moving slowly below, adjusting his lens. He entered the forest before full light chose a position on a slope overlooking the stream where the troop liked to gather and settled in. A 500mm lens brought him close enough to count individual hairs on the face of a female grooming her infant 30 meters away. He filmed through the whole morning without speaking to anyone or checking the time. But when he passed the row of holding pens at the back, he stopped. Not because of a sound, because of the absence of one. Most of the pens were noisy calls, movement, the rattle of wire mesh. The 5th pen from the end was completely silent. He stepped closer and looked through the chain link. A small monkey sat pressed into the far corner, back turned to the world, shoulders drawn in, head low. The fur was still the rough, uneven texture of an infant's coat, brown-gray. None of the silver that comes with age. He raised the camera out of reflex. His finger didn't press the shutter. He lowered it, stood looking at the small hunched back for a long moment, then walked on. That day he shot 482 images of the wild troop. He reviewed all of them before sleep. Not one was of the 5th pen. The following morning he took the same path because it was a shortcut, he reminded himself. The small monkey was still in the same corner, still turned away, still silent. He stopped longer than the day before. A keeper came past Kenji, 38, 12 years, at the center, rubber boots, worn pale to the knee. Takumi asked about the monkey in the 5th pen, the way you ask about something you're only mildly curious about. Kenji looked into the pen and exhaled. Female estimated 8 weeks old at the time of rescue, found alone on the northeast flank of Mount Yake, about 4 kilometers from here. Mother unaccounted for, no body found, no cause established, no troop identified. Medically stable after 10 days of treatment, a small wound on the right shoulder, healed cleanly, blood work, normal weight on track. But reintegration had failed. The resident recovery troop had spent 8 months building something together, bonds, order, belonging, and it was already complete. This infant belonged to none of them. She was driven off not from aggression, just from the simple fact that there was no place for her in something already complete. 3 attempts. 3 failures. Isolated now, temporarily, while the team waited to see if another group might be a better fit. 3 weeks so far. Takumi looked into the pen. The monkey hadn't moved, no response to the voices of 2 people standing 3 meters away. Kenji added quietly that she wasn't afraid of people. She'd just stopped expecting anything from them. He said it and then walked on. Takumi stood there after Kenji had gone. There was something in that, not afraid, just no longer expecting, that he couldn't process quickly enough to set it down and leave. He went back to the forest, shouldered his camera, and kept working. Every afternoon he stopped for a few minutes in front of the 5th pen. Didn't go in, didn't call to her, didn't do anything. Just stood the way you stand in front of something you don't understand yet, but aren't ready to walk away from. Through the lens, he watched how she sat, shoulders always drawn in at the same angle, had always bowed the same way. Not the posture of an animal at rest. The posture of a body that had learned to take up as little space as possible. The monkeys in the wild troop rested entirely differently, backs straight, heads up, eyes moving constantly across the tree line. This one sat as though she was trying to disappear. He took some frames, looked at them on the screen, deleted them. He couldn't figure out what caption he would write for that, and without a caption, he didn't know what he was doing with a photograph. He lowered the camera and kept walking. On the 9th day of the contract, late afternoon, the light already low and gold across the valley. Takumi was heading toward the 5th pen out of habit when he heard slow footsteps behind him. He turned. A white dog was coming up the path from the direction of the center's main building, moving unhurriedly, rear legs slightly uneven, head dropping gently with each step. Thick white coat, the broad chest and upright ears of a Hokkaido tail carried level, not wagging, not tucked. The dog didn't look at Takumi. It walked past him, continuing toward the enclosures. It moved along the fence line, not fast, not slow, following a route Takumi could tell it had walked many times before. The right rear step fell slightly shorter than the left. In front of the 5th pen, the dog stopped. Didn't look inside, just stopped. Then lay down, pressing its body close against the wire head, settling onto its front paws, eyes closing. Takumi stood very still. From the darkest corner of the pen, a small head turned slowly toward the outside world. Momiji looked at the white dog lying on the other side of the fence. It was the first time in 3 weeks she had turned to face anything beyond her own corner. He didn't raise the camera. He stood without moving, breathing quietly until the light failed completely and Kenji came out to bring the dog in. Yuki, Kenji said. 11 years old, the center's patrol dog for 9 years, retired the previous winter when the rear legs started going. Since retirement, she'd been walking the fence line every afternoon, out of habit, the same route, the same slow rhythm, as though her body still remembered a job that no longer existed. Nobody had ever asked her to stop in front of that pen, Kenji added, with something close to a smile. Then he walked back toward the main building, Yuki following slowly behind. Takumi watched them go until they disappeared into the gray dusk. He turned back to the 5th pen. Momiji had turned away again. But the set of her back looked different somehow. Not smaller, not larger, just different. He couldn't have said how. The next morning he walked the same path because it was a shortcut, he told himself again. Yuki was already there when he arrived. Same time, same route, same spot. Takumi was sitting on a fallen log about 15 meters from the pen, eating an onigiri from the convenience store at the edge of the village. He watched Yuki settle in front of the pen, same posture as before, front legs, straight head down. Momiji didn't turn around right away. 7 minutes he counted without meaning to, and then the small head turned slowly toward the fence. Not fully out, not looking directly at Yuki, just angled that way as though listening. Yuki didn't move, didn't look through the wire, didn't wag, did nothing. Being there seemed to be enough. The day after that, Momiji turned in 3 minutes. The day after that, 2. By the 6th day, the small monkey was already sitting facing outward before Yuki arrived, waiting. Takumi watched from a distance. Each afternoon didn't come closer, didn't shift position, didn't let himself become a variable in something that was following its own logic. He filmed occasionally, but not much. Raising the camera felt like it would break something. On the 9th afternoon since Yuki had started coming, Takumi moved closer. Not to get nearer to Momiji. Yuki was old and liked company, Kenji had said. And Takumi had seen that was true, the way the dog would press its head against the knee of anyone who sat nearby long enough. He settled onto the grass about 4 meters from the pen, back against an oak tree, legs stretched out. Yuki glanced at him once, then looked away. He opened his bag and ate, not looking toward the pen. The afternoon wind came through the valley, carrying pine and cold earth, and the particular blankness of Kamikochi in late autumn. A few last maple leaves still clung to the higher branches, red and yellow, shivering. About 15 minutes in, Yuki walked to him and pressed its head against his knee. The fur was warmer than he expected, thick and dense with the smell of damp soil and earlier sun still caught in it. He rested his left hand on its back, not stroking, just resting. They sat like that until evening, the light moving from gold to gray to thin violet on the ridge of Yake. The following day he sat a meter closer to the pen. The day after, a meter closer still. He didn't plan it that way. He simply sat where it felt right. Yuki found him, and what felt right kept shifting a little closer each afternoon, without him deciding to move. One evening, he realized he was sitting close enough to hear Momoji's breathing through the wire. He hadn't noticed crossing that distance. He wasn't sure when it had happened. Then, one afternoon, the 14th day of the contract, colder than the ones before, breath coming out white. He was sitting beside Yuki, left hand on its back eyes, somewhere down the valley, when he heard a quiet sound from the fence. He didn't turn his head. Small, careful, the sound of a small body moving very slowly across a concrete floor. He still didn't turn. Then something touched the back of his right hand. Light, just a brush, like a blade of grass in a small wind. He looked down. Momiji was standing at the wire, one small finger just withdrawn from the back of his hand, through a gap in the mesh, not reaching for him, reaching for the scent that had moved from Yuki's coat to his skin. She pulled back the moment he looked down. But she didn't retreat to her corner. She stood there, eyes lowered, one finger still trembling slightly. He didn't move. He sat, breathing steadily until the light was gone. That night, the temperature dropped suddenly from 4 degrees in the afternoon to -3 after midnight, the way Kamikochi does in November, when wind comes off the top of Yake without warning. He heard Kenji's phone ring at 1 in the morning through the thin wall of the guest house. Lay there listening to footsteps, a door, a pen being unlocked. Then silence. He couldn't sleep after that. He put on his jacket and went outside. The air was dark and cold, and still breath turning to dense white vapor. The grass already beginning to stiffen underfoot. Through the small window of the duty room, he could see Kenji bent over Momoji's pen with a flashlight and a medical bag. She was running a fever, curled in the corner, shaking. He stood outside, didn't knock, didn't ask. Just stood there because he didn't know where else to be. Yuki came out from the staff dog quarters. No one had called. No one had led her and walked through the dark directly to Momoji's pen. She lay down and pressed her body against the wire. Warmth conducted through cold metal. Takumi looked at her for a long moment. Then he went and got the blanket from his room, spread it on the ground nearby, and sat down on it, not going in, not doing anything, just there. The night was long. He dozed against the wall and startled awake, his back stiffening in the cold, the sky overhead still fully black. Each time he woke, Yuki hadn't moved. The same position, pressed flat against the wire, breathing steadily into the dark. He didn't know what time it was when the cold got into his hands. He pulled his sleeves down over them and stayed. Light began coming at 6, gray and gradual through the mist. Kenji came out to check on Momiji, temperature stable through the worst of it. Takumi stood, folded the blanket. Kenji looked at him once and said nothing. That morning, after Kenji had gone inside, Takumi sat beside Yuki in front of the pen. Momiji stood at the wire, eyes still red from the night, fur ruffled, but standing. She looked at Yuki, then at Takumi. Then very slowly she reached through the mesh and placed her hand in the white fur of the old dog's back. Not for a moment, the way she had touched him before. This time she left it there, fingers slowly warming in the thick coat. He watched that small hand and didn't say anything. That was the 18th day of a 3-week contract. Back in his room that evening, the editor's email had been waiting since morning, confirmation of the next project, a Shinkansen ticket to Tokyo booked for the 22nd. He read it, looked at the date on the screen, looked out the window toward the pens, couldn't see anything in the dark, but he knew exactly where the 5th pen was. He put the phone down. He didn't reply that night. Not the next morning either. On the 20th day, he went to the front desk and extended his room for another 3 weeks, paying in cash. Then he called the editor, not an email, a call. He apologized, canceled the next project, said he'd explain later. The editor asked why. He said there was something he needed to stay for. He didn't say anything else, and after a brief silence, the editor didn't ask. That afternoon, he found Kenji. asked permission to stay on, and observed the socialization process. No intervention, no participation, just presence. Kenji studied him for a moment, the look of someone who had seen enough in 12 years to stop being surprised by the way people respond to animals. He nodded and set the terms no direct contact with Momiji, no feeding, no interference. Just part of the landscape, nothing more. Takumi nodded. The days that followed, he was there, every afternoon. Same time, same spot, same old blanket spread on the ground. Yuki arrived, settled. Takumi sat beside her. He brought the onigiri from the same convenience store, ate it without looking toward the pen. He watched the light change on the fence line. He watched Yuki's breathing. Gradually, Momiji stopped waiting for Yuki to arrive, before moving to the front of the pen. She was already sitting facing outward when they got there. Waiting. Not for Yuki or for Takumi specifically, just oriented that way toward whatever was out there. But oriented outward was enough. Those evenings he stayed a little later each day, until the sky went fully dark, until Kenji switched off the enclosure lights, until there was nothing left to see but darkness and the sound of wind moving through the valley. His camera stayed in the bag. Kenji started the socialization process in the first week of December. Not the full troop yet, just 2 of the smallest, in a patch of open ground that didn't belong to anyone. The first session, Momiji pressed herself into a corner back to the wire shoulders drawn in the familiar way. Takumi stood at the far end of the yard, far enough not to be a threat, close enough to be a fixed point in an unfamiliar space. Yuki lay near the fence line, eyes closed, breathing steadily, the same posture she'd held through hundreds of afternoons outside Momiji's pen. Momiji looked toward Yuki, looked toward Takumi, moved herself away from the corner by 30 centimeters. 30 centimeters is a lot. For a body that had spent weeks learning to take up as little space as possible, 30 centimeters is a long way to go. The next session, she moved further. The one after that, she sat in the middle of the neutral space, not on either side, not affiliated with anything, and watched the 2 others play from the distance of an observer. Not joining, but watching with something focused rather than afraid. Kenji stood beside Takumi one afternoon, without saying anything for a long time. Then he said quietly that she was learning from him. Takumi looked over. Kenji was watching Momiji sitting alone, at a remove from the group, not participating, just present. Takumi looked at her for a moment, then looked somewhere else. He didn't answer. Those afternoons, small snow had started falling on the summit of Yake, individual flakes drifting in the cold air, dissolving before they reached the valley floor. By the end of November, Yuki couldn't get up by herself in the mornings. It hadn't happened suddenly. The rear legs had been failing for weeks. Each day's walk a little shorter, each step a fraction less certain. Takumi had noticed before Kenji mentioned it had been counting without planning to the number of steps it took Yuki to get from the main building to her usual spot, and the number had been growing week by week, even though the distance hadn't changed. The morning she lay there and didn't rise when someone came. The morning the vet arrived and crouched beside her and shook his head. Something in the air of the center shifted that day, and nobody said what it was. Takumi sat with her through the whole afternoon, one hand resting on her back, not speaking. Yuki breathed steadily, eyes closed, her tail moving slowly, whenever his hand moved slowly. After that, she was brought out in a small cart each afternoon. Same spot, same position, white head on white paws, just no longer walking there herself. It was the first time Momiji had seen Yuki not arrive on her own feet. The small monkey stood pressed against the fence, looking out not toward the trees or the sky, but directly at Yuki, standing at the outward-facing side of the pen instead of the dark inner corner, standing and watching, in a way she had never watched anything since the day she arrived. Kenji opened the pen for the first time on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after rain, the grass still wet and catching light. A controlled area, a temporary fence wider than the pen, the recovery troop well back, just Momiji, an open space, and Yuki's blanket in the corner. Momiji stood at the open gate. Didn't step out. Takumi was at the far corner, hands in his pockets, not looking directly at her. Yuki lay on the blanket nearby. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Neither Kenji nor Takumi spoke, neither moved. The only sounds were the wind through the pine trees above the center and the distant calls of the recovery troop waiting somewhere beyond the temporary fence. Momiji looked at the open gate, looked at the grass on the other side of it, looked toward Yuki, and stepped out. Not running one step at a time, feet finding the wet grass, stopping when the cold and strangeness of it registered beneath her. Her left rear foot lifted slightly off the chill ground. She stood still, looked down at her own feet on the grass, then kept moving toward Yuki, toward the blanket, toward Takumi standing there like a tree that had been present long enough to stop being a threat. Momiji sat down beside Yuki for the first time, with no fence between them. Side by side on the same old blanket. Takumi didn't raise the camera. He didn't take a single frame that day. Over the weeks that followed, Momiji gradually worked her way into the recovery troop, not smoothly, not in a straight line, some days driven off and retreating to the familiar corner. But the familiar corner was no longer the dark end of a pen. It was wherever Yuki was lying, wherever Takumi was sitting. She would come back after a rejection settle near the old dog's warm flank and sit there until whatever had frightened her settled too. Then she would go again. Momiji learned the troop's rules slowly and patiently, watching first, trying pulling back when she needed to, trying again when she was ready. Takumi sat in his usual spot and waited. Some days there wasn't much to see. Some days there was. He kept the camera out of it either way. Yuki wasn't improving, the rear legs nearly useless now, most hours spent in the warm care room. But every afternoon, she was still brought out to the same spot, and every afternoon, Momiji still came, sat close sometimes, grooming slowly along the ridge of Yuki's white shoulder. No fence between them. There never would be again. Early December. Takumi started going back out to photograph the wild troop in the mornings. Not because of a contract. There was no contract anymore, but because this was why he'd come to Kamikochi. And Kamikochi in early winter at dawn was still beautiful in ways he'd never once stopped seeing. The first snow of the season reached the summit of Yake on the 12th of December, a thin layer white and precise against the dark green of the pine forest below it. He photographed it from the wooden bridge at 6 in the morning, the same spot where he'd stood adjusting his lens on the first day, 7 weeks ago. The water below the bridge was the same pale green. The mist still lay along the Azusa. He stood there a while before moving on. December mornings were colder than November by a wide margin. Breath came out in heavy white clouds. Mist settled lower on the surface of the river, the path into the forest crunching slightly underfoot, where last night's frost hadn't yet lifted. He went out at dawn and came back in the afternoon, same route, same rhythm. The forest was still the forest. The wild troop still moved between the same ridges, the same streams. But the way he looked through the lens each morning, sitting with one animal, staying still, not pressing, not certain he understood what he was seeing, that had changed. He wasn't sure it showed in the photographs. He wasn't sure it didn't. On the 17th of December, Kenji called while he was on the upper slope. The wild troop on Yake was moving down. They might pass along the hillside beside the center that afternoon. Takumi came down. By the time he reached the rescue center, the recovery troop was already agitated, calling to each other, running the fence line, standing upright, and staring toward the far hillside. The wild troop was moving a few dark shapes on the northeast slope, calls carrying down through the cold air. Momiji was standing in the middle of the recovery troop. Not at the edge, not in a corner, in the middle. He saw that and raised the camera. The recovery troop began moving toward the hillside. Momiji ran with them. Takumi lowered the camera, watched. Then halfway there, Momiji stopped, turned and looked back toward Takumi. One beat, no longer than a breath. Then she turned back and ran on, folding into the troop, moving up the slope toward the shape still traveling across the mountain above. He raised the camera, pressed the shutter. In the frame, Momiji running toward the tree line, the recovery troop around her, the slope of Yake, behind late afternoon light gold on the snow. The red wool scarf was still around his neck. Outside the frame, He stood watching until there was nothing left to see on the hillside. That evening, Takumi sat beside Yuki in the care room. Small space warmed the smell of pine timber and faint antiseptic. Yuki lay on a thick pad, head resting on his leg. Eyes closed, breathing slow, tail moving occasionally with the same quiet rhythm as always. He thought about the first afternoon he'd sat down near the pen, eating an onigiri, pretending he wasn't watching anything. He thought about the night on the blanket, his back going stiff in the cold, Yuki motionless against the wire. He thought about the morning Momoji's hand had come through the mesh and found not him, but the warmth his hand had left on Yuki's coat. Outside the small window, the sky over Kamikochi faded deep blue to black, the first star appearing above the summit of Yike Sharp, the way winter stars are when there are no clouds. He sat the way he had sat outside the pen, the night Momoji ran a fever. The way he had sat the day the email came from Tokyo. The way he had sat through all those damp grass evenings, with breath turning white in the cold, just there long enough, not going anywhere. Yuki's fur was warm under his hand. The slow, even breathing of the old dog filled the room with something ancient and calm. A second star appeared above the ridge of Yake, then a third, then more, each one coming on quietly above the snow. He had come to photograph wild monkeys. He left with one photograph and 2 reasons to come back.